Tonight, beneath the hush of a winter sky, we open a door into a night when the wind itself seemed alive. A night when an American city stood frozen in time. Frozen Buffalo. The blizzard of '77 that turned a city into ice is a tale of roaring whiteouts, buried roads, stranded souls, and unexpected unity, yet told gently, slowly, like a lullaby carved from snow and memory. A quiet hook drifts in now. Somewhere within this storm, a single light flickers in the darkness, and the story of those who survived and those who waited begins to warm like a distant ember. Before we continue, I'd like to gently invite everyone watching, whether you're tuning in late at night from the U.S., early morning in Europe, or a quiet snowy afternoon in Canada, to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what time you're watching and where you're joining from. Your presence means more than you know. Take a moment to settle in. Adjust your blankets, ease your breathing, let the world soften around you. Prepare your mind for a slow, soothing journey through swirling frost and gentle resilience. And now, let us step into the story. Buffalo had known winter many times before, but never like this. Never with the eerie stillness that settled over the city on the evening before the blizzard arrived. The air felt strangely hollow, as though it were holding its breath. Streetlights glowed with a faint golden haze, their halos trembling in a sky the color of steel. Along the empty sidewalks, a dusting of old snow clung to curbs and lawns, hardened by weeks of relentless cold. It crunched sharply beneath the few footsteps that passed, each step echoing like brittle glass breaking. The wind, unusually gentle, threaded itself between houses, brushing softly against shutters and leaving behind a whispering chill that raised goosebumps along anyone who ventured outside. Inside cozy homes, people settled into their routines. Fireplaces crackled, lamps cast warm pools of light across living rooms, and radios hummed with weather forecasts that grew slightly more urgent by the hour. High winds, drifting snow, lake effect intensifying. The words floated out of speakers, ignored by some, heeded by others, but understood by all to be part of Buffalo's winter language. On the edges of Lake Erie, darkness rolled over the frozen surface like a slow wave. Beneath that vast sheet of ice lay snowbanks, mountains of it, pressed and sculpted by weeks of storms. But tonight they rested silent and unmoving, unaware that the winds about to awaken would lift them like feathers and turn them into walls of blinding white. Somewhere across the city, a single window glowed in the upper floor of a small home. A woman stood there, hands wrapped around a warm mug, sensing something she could not name. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like the awareness that nature was gathering its breath before releasing something powerful. The temperature dropped again, subtle but sharp. Chimneys exhaled thin trails of smoke that rose straight upward, untouched by breeze. The world felt paused, suspended, as though waiting for a signal. And in that deep, icy stillness, the first hint of distant wind began to sigh. The morning began with a brittle kind of cold, the sort that crept beneath door frames and slipped into gloves, numbing fingertips before anyone had taken a dozen steps. Yet it was not the cold that unnerved the city first. It was the sound. Just after dawn, a low, rumbling moan drifted across Buffalo, rolling between houses like some ancient creature awakening beneath the frozen earth. It wasn't constant. It rose, then faded, then rose again, like the long breath of something powerful gathering strength. People paused in their kitchens, forks suspended, coffee cups halfway to lips, listening to the uneasy tremor that rattled the windows. Then the real wind arrived. It swept in with a suddenness that felt impossible, slamming into the sides of houses, swirling around corners in wild spirals and pushing against doors with a force that made hinges groan. Snow, once settled firmly on the frozen lake, lifted into the air as if pulled upward by invisible hands. Drifts tore loose, spinning into the sky, forming dense, twisting clouds that blotted out the horizon. Within minutes, visibility shrank from miles to yards, then from yards to barely the reach of an outstretched arm. Drivers on their morning commute found themselves swallowed whole. Headlights dissolved in the torrent, taillights vanished in the white abyss. Engines idled nervously in place as people realized they couldn't see the road, the cars beside them, or even the faint silhouettes of buildings they passed every day. Neighbors called to one another across yards, but their voices were shredded by the wind long before they reached the other side. A man trying to shovel his walkway watched the snow fly upward instead of sideways, scattering like sparks from a fire, vanishing into the storm before touching the ground again. Inside the city's quiet neighborhoods, front porches trembled under the pounding gusts. Snowflakes, sharper than they looked, whipped through the air in horizontal sheets, stinging like grains of salt against exposed faces. The world became a swirling blur of white movement and icy roar. Yet amid the chaos, there was a strange beauty. The way the whiteout wrapped everything in softness, the way roofs and fences blurred into one smooth, seamless shape, as if the city were slowly turning into a sculpture of ice. This blizzard, though, was only beginning to show its strength. And deep beneath the storm's fury, whispers of fear and wonder intertwined, as Buffalo realized it was facing a winter unlike any it had ever known. By early afternoon, Buffalo no longer resembled a city. It looked like a dreamscape carved entirely from white, shifting endlessly under the breath of the wind. Streets that had been familiar and busy that morning were now gone, erased beneath towering waves of drifting snow that moved like living tides. Cars vanished first. One moment they were lined along curbs, their shapes clear and simple, and the next they became low, rounded mounds. Snow stacked against windshields, buried wheel wells, and climbed up doors as though trying to seal everything inside. Some vehicles were swallowed so quickly that their owners, stepping out to check conditions, blinked in disbelief at how completely the world had transformed in minutes. Traffic lights swung violently at the ends of intersections, little blinking dots in the white nothingness, while the wires that held them creaked and shuddered, coated in fresh frost. Their colors, red, yellow, green, bled faintly through the swirling snow, but the storm's fury drowned them out, leaving drivers to inch forward blindly or abandon their cars altogether. Sidewalks became indistinguishable from roads. Driveways blended with front yards. Fences disappeared beneath sloping snowbanks, their presence marked only by the faint bump beneath the drifts. Even the tallest shrubs vanished, overtaken by the relentless accumulation. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, unable to see more than a few ghostly shapes, perhaps a mailbox, perhaps a buried trash bin, half swallowed by the storm. The sky itself looked like a blank page, empty except for the endless swirling flakes drawn across it in wild, frantic curves. Inside homes, the cold seeped deeper. Heaters hummed with steady effort, fighting a losing battle as drafts pushed through tiny cracks. Window panes trembled under the gusts, each vibration sending shivers through the walls. And within this pale, frozen silence, a growing awareness settled into every household. The storm was not passing quickly. It was worsening. Across the city, people reached for radios. The broadcasters' voices were calm, measured, but beneath their tone lay a weighted tension. Stay indoors. Roads are impassable. Visibility is near zero. Do not attempt to travel. Still, some had no choice. A nurse driving home from a night shift found her car trapped in snow taller than the hood. A man heading to check on his elderly parents lost sight of the street within seconds and wandered a few steps at a time, groping for something, anything solid. Those footsteps were instantly erased behind them. Buffalo was not merely covered in snow, it was becoming part of it. As the day darkened into a storm-blue twilight, the wind only grew more relentless, howling through Buffalo like a living force determined to swallow every trace of warmth. Drifts rose higher, reshaping the city block by block. What had once been streets were now deep valleys. What had once been alleys now looked like frozen ravines where shadows and snow merged into one. For those caught outside when the storm tightened its grip, the world became a maze of whiteness. A mail carrier, unable to see even his own gloved hand stretched in front of him, crouched beside a snow-packed doorway, listening to the storm batter the street like 1,000 pounding fists. His bag lay somewhere beneath the drifts, lost in the chaos. Every breath he took filled his mouth with frozen crystals, sharp and metallic, clinging to his scarf and eyelashes until they stiffened like tiny glass needles. A young couple, who had ventured out to check on a relative just a few blocks away, found themselves moving in circles. Their voices were swallowed instantly, stolen by the wind before reaching one another's ears. They grasped hands tightly, feeling their way along the sides of houses, fingertips brushing against buried gutters and ice-sheened siding until their knuckles went numb. Each step felt heavier, as though the snow were tightening around their boots, drawing them deeper into its grip. In the heart of the city, a stranded bus sat half-buried, its headlights still glowing faintly beneath a veil of swirling white. Inside, passengers huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets, coats, anything that could trap even a scrap of heat. The windows had frosted over completely, thick, opaque, and cold to the touch, turning the world outside into a shifting blur. Someone had hung a coat over the open crack of the door, trying to stop the icy drafts that crept in like fingers searching for skin. Time inside the bus slowed, each minute stretching out under the weight of uncertainty. A soft murmur of voices floated through the dim interior, quiet conversations meant to keep fear at bay. A woman recited stories from her childhood winters. A teenager offered snacks from a backpack. An elderly man hummed an old folk tune, barely audible over the roar outside. In neighborhoods across Buffalo, people began realizing that they were now sealed inside their homes, front doors pressed inward, blocked by drifts taller than the porches themselves. Some couldn't even open them more than an inch. Windows, once clear, were packed tightly with snow, turning living rooms into caves lit by lamps and candle glow. The storm didn't just trap people physically, it wrapped itself around the entire city, tightening, closing in, making Buffalo feel smaller and more fragile with every passing hour. Yet, even in the white abyss, the spark of human resilience flickered quietly, refusing to be extinguished. As night settled fully over Buffalo, the storm pressed harder against the city, turning every home into a small, flickering sanctuary, resisting an ocean of frost. Windows throbbed under the force of the wind, bowing inward with each gust as though the storm were breathing against the glass. Frost branched across the panes in delicate lace-like patterns, beautiful, but cold as stone to the touch. Inside these homes, the glow of lamps and candles cast soft halos of warmth, but even that warmth felt thin, stretched, fragile. Families gathered in living rooms layered with blankets. Quilts were stacked on couches, coats were draped across laps, hats and scarves were worn indoors as though the walls could no longer hold back the winter. Every breath that left their lips seemed to hang in the air a fraction longer, a subtle reminder that warmth was slowly becoming a luxury. Kitchens turned into makeshift hearths as pots of soup simmered quietly on stoves, their steam fogging the air as people ladled broth into cups usually used for tea. The scent of vegetables, chicken, and spices drifted through cold hallways, comforting and familiar, anchoring everyone to the safe, slow rhythms of home. Some families pointed flashlights toward their windows, only to see nothing but a thick wall of white packed tightly against the glass. It was unsettling, like being underground or beneath the sea, sealed away from the world above. In basements and garages, the creaks of the storm echoed through pipes and beams. The house seemed to breathe and shift under the weight of the snow, piling relentlessly against it. And yet, despite the deepening cold, moments of quiet tenderness unfolded. A mother wrapped her child in a favorite blanket and told stories of winters she remembered from her own youth. Snowball fights, sleigh rides, the magic of the first snowfall. Her voice was soft, rising and falling with the gentle cadence of reassurance. An elderly couple lit a single candle and held hands, listening to the storm's roar while sharing memories of every winter they had weathered together. Their smiles were faint but steady, warmed by decades of companionship. Neighbors, unable to see one another through the blizzard, tapped lightly on shared walls or called through vents, checking in, offering comfort through muffled shouts. Even without visibility, the feeling of connection remained, a thin but vital thread woven through the frozen night. Buffalo, though buried and shivering, had not yet lost its warmth. By the second night, a deep and uncanny stillness settled over Buffalo, one that didn't come from peace, but from the overwhelming dominance of the storm. The usual hum of distant traffic, the rumble of buses, the small chorus of city sounds, all had disappeared beneath the thick, ceaseless roar of the blizzard. It was as if the world outside had been swallowed whole. In neighborhoods where lights had flickered bravely through the first day, darkness now claimed many homes. Power lines, weighed heavy with ice, snapped one by one, their sharp cracks echoing across empty streets. The sudden blackouts left houses drenched in shadow, lit only by lanterns, candles, or the warm flicker of old fireplaces revived for the first time in years. In that dim, wavering glow, every sound grew louder. The storm's wind became a long, unbroken howl that rattled vents and moaned beneath eaves. Snow pressed against doors with the slow, steady insistence of a rising tide. Icicles lengthened in the darkness, dripping in the brief moments when the wind paused, then freezing again as the cold reclaimed them. The city, normally vibrant even on its snowiest days, seemed to vanish. Downtown skyscrapers were hidden behind thick clouds of swirling white, their outlines blurred until they became nothing more than faint ghostly shadows. Street signs disappeared under enormous drifts, some buried almost to the top. Even familiar landmarks, schools, churches, corner shops, were reduced to vague lumps beneath sculpted waves of snow. Inside a small house on the east side, A father listened carefully to the silence beyond the storm's howl, trying to determine whether the distant cracking he heard was a tree splitting or something closer, a porch beam bowing under the weight of the drifts. He carried his children into the center of the living room, away from windows, and wrapped them in thick blankets. Their breaths formed faint foggy clouds in the cold air. Elsewhere, a single candle flickered in the window of an elderly woman's home. She had placed it there deliberately, a tiny beacon of life against the dark. Through the snow-packed glass, its golden glow seemed to float like a memory, fragile, delicate, but stubborn. The roads, now completely impassable, were unnervingly quiet. No engines, no footsteps, only the restless whisper of wind dragging snow across frozen pavement. For the first time in generations, Buffalo felt paused, suspended in a frozen moment, as though time itself had slowed its breath. But within that quiet, beneath the layers of cold and darkness, something resilient remained, an ember waiting, refusing to die out. By the next morning, Buffalo awoke to a landscape that no longer resembled a city at all. It looked more like a vast, frozen wilderness, sculpted by a storm with no intention of stopping. The blizzard had shaped the world into towering forms, each drift larger and stranger than the last. Some snow banks rose as high as rooftops, their curved surfaces glinting with a faint blue sheen under the faint muted daylight. They looked like frozen dunes in an Arctic desert, their ridges sharpened by wind and layered like ancient cliffs. Where streets once stretched in clear lines, there were now deep trenches carved by gusts, winding unpredictably between the towering drifts. Homes appeared half submerged, their windows peeking out like eyes barely above water. Chimneys were buried to their rims, exhaling thin trails of smoke into the swirling air. The smell of burning wood drifted faintly across neighborhoods, a soft reminder that inside each snow-capped shelter, a family was holding on. For those venturing a cautious glance outside, opening the front door was an impossible task. Many found only a wall, a solid curtain of packed snow pressed tightly against the entryway. When a door did manage to open even an inch, a cold plume of white spilled inward, scattering across the floor in a soft rush. On some streets, cars were buried so completely that their shapes became indistinguishable from the drifts. Only a side view mirror here, a windshield wiper there, or a tiny raised corner of a roof hinted at the hidden vehicles beneath. Residents stared out at their porches, knowing their cars were only a few steps away, but feeling as though they might as well be miles distant. Utility poles leaned under the weight of frost, some nearly bending to the ground. Streetlights poked out from the snow at odd angles, glowing faintly like forgotten lanterns half swallowed by the storm. Even the tallest landmarks, statues, signs, and storefronts were coated in thick ice that distorted their shapes into something otherworldly. Yet there was a strange calm in the transformation. With the roads invisible and the city muffled, sound moved differently. Voices echoed off snowbanks in soft, blurry ripples. The crunch of boots disappeared into powder so deep it swallowed footsteps entirely. Every movement felt slow, cautious, careful. The world, though overwhelming, held a quiet beauty, a stillness that shimmered just beneath the hardship. Buffalo had become a frozen sculpture, breathtaking and brutal all at once, and the storm, far from finished, continued to weave its icy work. By the fourth day, Buffalo officials and volunteers knew they could no longer wait for the storm to ease. They had to act, even if the blizzard still snarled across the city like a living force. The call went out quietly at first, then urgently, spreading through radios, emergency teams, and neighborhood whispers. People were trapped cold and running low on supplies. Help was needed, even in the white abyss. But navigating the frozen labyrinth was unlike anything rescuers had ever faced. Snowmobiles became lifelines, gliding over drifts taller than vans. Their engines sputtered and strained, the cold biting into metal and fuel lines, but they pushed forward. Riders leaned close to their handlebars, squinting through goggles that quickly frosted over despite constant wiping. Those on foot moved with slow, deliberate determination. Their boots sank deep into powder that came up nearly to their knees, and each step felt like wading through a soft, endless ocean. Ropes were tied around waists to keep teams linked together so no one disappeared into the swirling white. Between the towering drifts, rescuers found eerie pockets of quiet, narrow corridors where the wind calmed for a moment before whipping around again with renewed fury. In these small windows of calm, they listened carefully for sounds, a knock, a voice, the faint tapping from inside a buried home. Inside one snow-buried house, a family huddled near their fireplace, its flame small but steady. They had been trapped for nearly 48 hours. When they heard the faint scraping from outside, shovels cutting into the drift, they felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Moments later, the front door pushed open slightly, revealing a sliver of daylight and the outline of a rescuer wrapped in layers of winter gear. In another neighborhood, a rescue team found a stranded bus, nearly invisible beneath the drifts. They dug their way to the door, the metal icy under their gloves. Inside, passengers rose to greet them with relieved smiles, the dim glow of their makeshift lanterns casting soft shadows across tired faces. Across the city, neighbors joined the efforts, passing shovels hand to hand, calling out to one another, offering food and blankets to anyone who needed them. Even from windows blocked by snow, people tapped messages of encouragement to rescuers outside. Communication lines had thinned, roads were gone, but community remained. As the storm raged overhead, rescue efforts continued like a heartbeat, steady, stubborn, hopeful. As the storm stretched into yet another night, an almost dreamlike atmosphere settled over Buffalo, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and surreal stillness. The blizzard had continued for so long that many residents could no longer remember what the city looked like beneath all the white. Time blurred, days blended together. Nightfall no longer brought rest, only deeper cold. This night was the harshest of them all. The temperature plunged even lower, the kind of cold that felt ancient, sharp enough to sting through layers of clothing, heavy enough to make the air itself seem brittle. Houses groaned under the enormous weight of snow, their roofs bowed in slow surrender. Icicles hung like crystal spears from gutters, some so long they nearly touched the buried ground. Inside one small home, a family gathered in a single room, the warmest one left. The walls felt colder than stone, and the floor seemed to hum with the low vibration of the storm outside. The only light came from a pair of candles flickering on a dresser, their flame swaying with each tremor of wind that rattled the windows. The father listened carefully, every crack, every creak, every gust. His children slept huddled beneath blankets, their breath soft and steady, unaware of the strain he carried alone. He placed another log into the small wood stove, watching the embers flare briefly before settling into a gentle glow. That glow was their comfort, their anchor against the storm's endless roar. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded. A woman wrapped in scarves sat silently beside her radio, hoping for any update, news that help was coming, or reassurance that the worst would pass soon. The broadcast crackled, fading in and out, the static blending with the wind. She adjusted the dial slowly, hands trembling from cold, until a faint voice emerged. "Stay indoors. Stay warm. Emergency crews are working. Help is on the way." The words were simple, but they were everything. In another neighborhood, a lone man ventured from room to room of his darkened home, checking for drafts, placing towels beneath doors, and lighting a final candle. The storm's heavy blanket of snow muffled all outside sound, but made every noise inside echo louder: his footsteps, the faint rustle of blankets, the distant groan of a bending tree outside. This night felt endless. Yet he paused at the window, listening. Somewhere beneath the fierce winds there was a new rhythm, quiet but steady. Dogs barking faintly in the distance. A shout carried along the wind from a neighbor checking on another. A snowmobile's distant engine, muted but unmistakably present. Signs of life, signs of hope. The blizzard had power, but Buffalo had endurance. And even in the darkest night, the city's spirit did not waver. When morning arrived, it did not come with sunlight in the usual sense. Instead, it seeped slowly into the frozen world like a pale glow behind a curtain of frost, soft, muted, almost hesitant. The storm had not fully ended, but its grip loosened just enough for the sky to brighten, turning the white landscape into a silvery, shimmering expanse. Inside homes across Buffalo, people stirred at the subtle shift in light. It felt like the first sign of something changing, something easing. After so many nights filled with the storm's roar, this quiet brightness brought a fragile kind of relief. A child wrapped in blankets pressed a palm against a frosted window pane. Beneath a thin layer of ice, the world was unrecognizable. The glass was sculpted with delicate patterns, white feathers, branching crystals, swirling designs that looked like artwork etched by the cold itself. Beyond that icy veil, she could see only shapes softened by snow. A streetlight buried to its neck, a mailbox nearly swallowed whole, and above, the sky glowing like pearl. In another home, a man cleared a small peephole through the frost on his door window and blinked in astonishment. The snowdrift outside had risen almost halfway up the glass. Only inches of clear air existed at the very top, revealing a sliver of pale sky. He felt the weight of the storm anew, its force, its enormity, yet also the gentle promise that the world beyond was slowly waking. The air outside was still bitterly cold, but the wind had softened. Its howl had become a whisper, brushing lightly against the frozen shapes the storm had crafted. The silence that followed was deep, almost reverent, as though the city were catching its breath after being held too tightly for too long. On one street, a row of houses looked like they had been carved from ice. Their roofs were thick with snow, curved like soft dunes. Frozen curtains of icicles hung from gutters, glowing faintly in the dawn light. Chimneys puffed small clouds of smoke that drifted upward and vanished quickly in the chilled air. Somewhere nearby, a faint tapping echoed. A neighbor, knocking gently on a wall, checking in after the long night. Another knock answered, then another. Soft signals of connection passing through the quiet morning. The city felt fragile, encased in layers of cold and silence. Yet beneath it, warmth stirred. The blizzard had not fully released its hold, but the world was shifting. Dawn had found its way through the ice. As the pale morning strengthened, the people of Buffalo slowly began the delicate process of reclaiming their world. The storm had eased enough for brave souls to attempt the first steps outside, but those steps were not simple, not even close. For many, opening the front door was the first challenge. One woman pressed her shoulder against her frozen doorframe, feeling the resistance of the snow packed tightly on the other side. She pushed again, harder this time, and a thin crack of frigid air seeped in. A small cascade of snow slipped onto her floor, sparkling under the faint light. She cleared it gently with a broom, then pushed once more. Bit by bit, the door budged, like prying free a lid sealed shut by ice, and finally opened just wide enough for her to look outside. It felt like stepping out of a shelter into another world, a world made entirely of white. The walkway that once led to her porch had vanished beneath a smooth hill of snow rising above her waist. Her neighbor's house appeared half submerged, its roof peeking from behind a massive drift that had formed overnight like a frozen tidal wave. The road beyond wasn't a road anymore. It was a deep valley carved between towering walls of snow sculpted by the relentless wind. A man across the street managed to burrow his way through his own doorway, emerging like a climber from the mouth of an ice cave. His breath billowed in front of him, turning to glittering vapor. He lifted a hand to greet her across the silent space. She returned the gesture with a small, relieved smile. On another block, two neighbors used shovels to carve narrow tunnels from their front steps to the street. The air was crisp and strangely peaceful. Each scrape of metal against snow echoed through the quiet morning like the soft, rhythmic beat of a drum. Children peered out from behind windows, watching the adults dig. They saw the world transformed, no longer just snowy, but sculpted into shapes that were both beautiful and mysterious. Trees were encased in shimmering ice, their branches bending gracefully under the weight. Mailboxes looked like small frozen monuments. Cars resembled smooth white mounds that hid entire stories beneath them. Further downtown, a man opened the back door of his shop to find that the alley behind it had become a tunnel of snow twice his height. When he stepped inside, the tunnel absorbed his footsteps, muffling them as if the snow were swallowing sound itself. The air there was still, untouched, like a pocket of preserved quiet in the heart of the city. Everywhere people emerged slowly, cautiously, marveling at the frozen sculpture the blizzard had left behind. They moved with care through knee-deep powder, along ridges of compacted drifts, up makeshift steps carved into snowbanks, testing the shape of the world one step at a time. The city was waking, and even though the cold still clung to every corner, a sense of determination warmed each breath. Buffalo had survived the storm's longest night. Now it began the long journey out of the snow. By midday, the stillness of the post-blizzard morning began to shift, not because the storm had weakened further, but because the people of Buffalo were emerging in greater numbers, each one carrying a shovel, a broom, or simply the will to carve a passage back into the world. The sound of metal scraping snow became the new heartbeat of the city. Neighbors who had exchanged only muffled greetings through walls now met face to face atop towering drifts and narrow paths. Their breaths fogged the air as they worked, creating tiny clouds that rose and faded swiftly in the frigid sunlight. Every push of a shovel cut thin lines through the snowbanks, revealing small glimpses of buried porches, railings, and sidewalks that had been hidden for days. One block formed a chain, 4 houses in a row, where families took turns digging, each person pushing forward a few feet at a time before stepping aside for the next. The rhythm was slow but steady, like a tide rolling steadily against the frozen shore. Their laughter drifted softly across the cold air, a sound as welcoming as warmth itself. In another neighborhood, An elderly man stood on his porch, leaning on his shovel, breathing heavily. He had been trying to dig out alone, but the drift was nearly as tall as he was, just as fatigue began to weigh his arms down. Two teenagers from the house next door hopped over the snowbank with bright smiles and boundless energy. Without a word, they took up the task beside him. He watched them work, grateful, touched, and the stiffness in his shoulders eased. Further downtown, shop owners emerged from the backs of their stores, clearing narrow channels that curved like ancient paths through canyon-like drifts. The air smelled faintly of snow-dampened wood and cold metal. Some shopkeepers paused often to simply absorb the surreal beauty around them, towering walls of snow glowing softly in the winter light, icicles catching tiny sparks of color, frost-covered signs shimmering like silver. City workers joined the effort, using plows and heavy equipment where they could, but even the machines struggled. They moved slowly, pushing snow into towering heaps that seemed to reach for the sky. Each cleared stretch of road felt like a victory, a new artery of life reconnecting parts of the city long sealed away. And everywhere, small acts of kindness shaped the recovery. A woman shared hot tea in thermoses with workers clearing her street. A man with a generator invited neighbors to warm their hands inside his garage. A group of children dug tiny trails between houses, useless for travel but delightful for play, and their giggles fluttered across the snow like birdsong. Buffalo had been frozen into silence. Now it was thawing through human effort, human warmth, human determination. Paths were forming, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, and with each clearing the city began to remember its shape. As pathways widened and doorways reopened to the frozen world, Buffalo slowly uncovered not just roads and buildings, but stories, stories buried beneath the drifts, waiting patiently to be found, each one a quiet testament to survival, resilience, and unexpected grace. On a small side street, a family discovered their car fully entombed in ice and snow. Only the faint curve of the roof hinted at where it rested. As they dug together, mother, father, and teen-aged son, their shovels struck something solid beneath the powder. It wasn't metal. It was a cardboard box frozen in place, its edges softened by moisture. Inside, they found groceries a neighbor had left for them 2 nights earlier, hoping someone would retrieve the supplies before they spoiled. The cold had preserved everything perfectly. In the middle of hardship, they felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. In another neighborhood, a man clearing snow from around his garage heard a faint rhythmic tapping. He paused, leaning into the windless hush, then followed the sound around the corner. There, nearly buried, was a small wooden bird feeder. Inside it, protected from the worst of the storm, a tiny chickadee perched quietly. The man smiled, gently brushing snow from the feeder's entrance, creating a little tunnel so the bird could fly free when ready. It hopped closer, chirped once, a single bright note cutting through the cold, and fluttered into the pale sky. Across town, a group of rescuers discovered an abandoned car on what had once been a well-traveled road. They expected emptiness, but inside, huddled together beneath a blanket, were 2 strangers who had taken shelter during the storm. A local store owner had opened his door to them before things grew too dangerous, offering warmth, food, and a safe place to wait out the blizzard. They had stayed with him for days, sharing stories, brewing tea, and finding comfort in their unexpected refuge. Now they returned to their car with grateful smiles, ready to begin the long task of reclaiming their normal lives. Even small details told stories of endurance, trees, frozen solid but still standing, held smooth layers of snow on their branches like delicate sculptures. Porch swings hung motionless, half buried in drifts, yet sturdy beneath the weight. Children's sleds, abandoned before the blizzard's peak, peeked out from under ice as though waiting for laughter to return. And in one quiet cul-de-sac, a single lantern glowed behind a buried window. Inside, a man had kept it lit throughout the entire storm, a symbol of hope for anyone passing by, though no one truly had. When neighbors finally dug a path to his home, he welcomed them inside with warm smiles and a pot of simmering stew. The lantern flickered behind him, soft and golden, like the heartbeat of the house. Buffalo had endured something monumental. But in the storm's wake, what emerged was not just damage. It was the quiet, shining proof of human connection. As the sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, its light fell across Buffalo like a blessing, soft, golden, and almost unreal after days of storm-gray skies. Shadows returned to the world in long, delicate streaks. The white landscape glittered, as though sprinkled with crushed diamonds, each grain of snow catching the light in a tiny flash. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel hostile. It remained cold, yes, deeply, sharply cold, but the wind had softened enough that people could stand outside without bracing themselves. There was a gentle stillness in the city, a fragile calm that settled over the enormous drifts and narrow pathways carved by determined hands. The thaw wasn't immediate, it was slow, almost meditative. Icicles began to drip one droplet at a time, each fall echoing faintly against the frozen quiet. Snowbanks showed the slightest signs of settling, their sharp edges smoothing as sunlight warmed their top layers. Roofs, long weighed down, seemed to sigh with the first subtle hints of relief. People noticed these small changes with cautious hope. A woman leaned against her porch railing, now finally visible, and closed her eyes as the sunlight touched her face. Even through the bitter air, she felt the warmth like a promise. She whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular, just grateful for the light. Children, newly freed from the confinement of their snow-bound homes, ventured outside with wide-eyed wonder. They didn't run. The drifts were far too deep for that. But they explored, climbing small hills of snow that reached their chests, sliding down gentle slopes carved by their parents, and laughing when they toppled into powder so soft it swallowed them like a cloud. Their joy rang across the neighborhood, pure and bright. Across the city, families used this moment of calm to check on one another. Hands waved from porch to porch. Short conversations floated on the cold air. "Are you all right?" We finally dug out the back door. "Need anything? We have extra soup." For many, the thaw brought emotional warmth as well. The worst had passed. They had endured. And though the snow still towered around them, the blizzard's grip was loosening. Up on a rooftop, one of the few fully visible, an older man took a moment to simply look out at his transformed street. He saw neighbors helping one another dig cars out, children playing, and the glow of sunlight illuminating everything in soft gold. His heart swelled with a feeling he hadn't felt since before the storm, genuine, quiet hope. Buffalo was still frozen, still weary, but no longer afraid. The thaw had begun, tender and steady. With the sun lingering longer each day and the worst of the storm now behind them, Buffalo began the monumental task of reclaiming its roads, those familiar lifelines buried deep beneath towering hills of snow. What had once been straight, bustling streets now resembled narrow valleys, winding irregularly between walls of white that rose several feet above head height. The first to venture out were the plows, massive machines grown to life, their engines rumbling through the frozen stillness. They pushed forward slowly, cautiously, their blades meeting mountains of compacted snow that resisted at first, like stubborn ice sculptures sculpted by the blizzard's hand. With each pass, the blades carved new paths, thin, uneven lines cutting through the frozen landscape. Residents stepped aside as the plows rumbled past, leaving behind low ridges of snow that marked the beginnings of real roads again. Some waved, grateful. Others offered thermoses of hot coffee to the operators, who had been working tirelessly for hours, faces flushed from the cold and the constant focus. Firefighters and emergency crews soon followed, clearing intersections and checking cars left stranded during the storm. Many vehicles were still unrecognizable, buried so deeply they appeared as nothing more than rounded mounds scattered along the newly formed pathways. Rescue workers poked long poles into the drifts to identify where doors might be, carefully uncovering handles and windows, ready to assist anyone who might still be inside. In one neighborhood, a team uncovered a small sedan whose driver had abandoned it just in time to seek shelter. Once freed from its icy encasing, the car's doors opened stiffly, hinges cracking like thin sheet ice. Inside, a wool hat, a half-empty bottle of water, and a handwritten note remained untouched. Made it to the Johnsons' house. Be safe. The rescuers smiled, relieved. Elsewhere, residents joined hands with city crews, forming long lines to pass shovels, clear walkways, and widen newly carved paths. A sense of shared accomplishment filled the air. Each cleared stretch of street felt like reclaiming a piece of the world that had been taken from them. Little by little, traffic signs emerged from the drifts, coated in thick frost. Stoplights blinked faintly as power returned in patches. The hum of city life, once silenced, began to vibrate softly beneath the cold. And though the roads were far from fully open, their reappearance brought a quiet thrill. Parents pointed them out to children. "Look, the street's coming back." Elders smiled with recognition. "I remember that corner." Workers nodded with pride. "We're getting there." The city, once frozen into immobility, was beginning to move again. As the roads widened and neighborhoods reconnected, Buffalo began to exhale, slowly at first, like someone awakening from a long, cold sleep. The blizzard had held the city in its frozen grip for days, but now life stirred in gentle motions, spreading from street to street, home to home. The hum of engines returned in the distance, soft, careful, and infrequent, but unmistakably alive. Snowplows moved steadily, their blades carving clearer lines with every pass. A few brave cars crept behind them at a respectful distance, wheels crunching over packed snow. Their headlights cast long beams through the still lingering frost, illuminating the city's slow awakening. In neighborhoods where porches had been buried, people stood outside with hands on hips, surveying the transformation. They breathed deeply, letting the crisp air fill their lungs. Though still bitterly cold, it tasted fresher, lighter, no longer heavy with the suffocating closeness of the storm. One family gathered on their front steps, recently dug out, watching neighbors emerge one by one. The father waved to a man across the street, who grinned back while brushing snow off his coat. The mother called out greetings, her voice carrying easily now that the wind had quieted. Their children, bundled in puffy jackets, eagerly flopped into the nearest drift, laughing as they made deep impressions that would stay long after they climbed out. Elsewhere, small shops cautiously reopened their doors. A bakery owner cleared a thin path to her entrance and placed a hand-painted sign in the window, "Open, warm bread inside." The aroma soon drifted down the street, curling through the cold air like a comforting memory. People lined up not for lack of food, but for the comfort of normalcy, of warmth, of the simple act of sharing space again. Church bells rang faintly in the distance, their tones softened by layers of snow, but still carrying a sense of reassurance. Mail carriers began moving through partially cleared routes, handing out letters with a sympathetic smile. Some of those envelopes had waited days to be delivered. At one intersection, a group of volunteers worked together to lift a fallen street sign, its pole slightly bent but salvageable. They secured it upright and stepped back, admiring the small but meaningful restoration of order. Behind them, the sky brightened further, the sun pushing aside the last stubborn wisps of storm cloud. And in the heart of the city, the frozen silence that had once pressed inward now loosened its hold. Sounds returned, not all at once, but in comforting fragments. Shovels scraping, voices calling, engines humming, children laughing, doors opening. Buffalo was breathing again, slow, steady breaths, warming the frozen world, one inhale at a time. As the city warmed, slowly, quietly, but undeniably, people began doing something they hadn't been able to do during the storm. They talked. Not shouted through walls or tapped through vents, but stood face to face in the pale winter sunlight, sharing stories that had been waiting beneath the snow just as surely as the buried cars and rooftops. Some of these stories were whispered, some were spoken with lingering awe, and others carried soft laughter, the kind that only comes after fear fades and relief settles in. On a corner where the snow had been shaped into a small amphitheater by plows, neighbors gathered with cups of steaming coffee. They stood in a loose semicircle, boots planted firmly in the packed snow, scarves fluttering gently in the light breeze. One man recounted how he had spent an entire night with his dining chair stacked against the front door, believing the storm might push it open. His voice was playful now, though the memory still carried a hint of tension. The group chuckled, shaking their heads, knowing they had all felt some version of that fear. Nearby, a woman described how she had kept her children calm during the worst of the blizzard by turning the darkness into a game, naming the shapes of frost on the windows, imagining animals in the drifting snow patterns, and whispering stories until they fell asleep. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke. Those memories, once frightening, had softened into moments of tenderness. Elsewhere, two strangers who had shared a snowbound bus finally reunited. They laughed as they retold the tale of how passengers had passed around crackers, shared childhood stories, and even held an impromptu sing-along when the storm was at its loudest. What had been a moment of fear now felt like the beginning of a friendship forged in frost. An elderly man sat in a folding chair outside his home, his breath misting rhythmically as he spoke to a small cluster of listeners. He recalled the blizzard of '44, describing how he and his brothers had dug tunnels through the snow just to feed their animals. People leaned closer, mesmerized, not just by his words, but by the way history echoed through the decades, connecting past storms with the one they had just survived. And still more stories drifted through the thawing air. A teenager who helped rescue an elderly neighbor by digging a narrow trench from house to house. A nurse who walked half a mile through waist-deep snow to reach her patients. A couple who lit lanterns in every window of their home so that anyone lost could find a warm door. Each tale carried a piece of the storm's heart, its fear, its beauty, its human warmth. But as these stories mingled, something remarkable happened. The blizzard's memory began to change shape. It was no longer only a tale of cold and isolation. It became a tapestry woven from countless moments of kindness, courage, and connection, threads warming the frozen narrative. The thaw continued slow and steady, but the story spread faster, bringing color back into the whitewashed world. Buffalo had endured the storm. Now it was remembering itself, one shared story at a time. With each passing day, the world of Buffalo shifted from crisis to renewal. Though the drifts still towered like miniature mountains and the cold still clung to every corner, something within the city had changed, softened, warmed, and awakened. The storm that once silenced everything had given way to a new kind of stillness, one filled with gratitude rather than fear. As sunlight stretched longer across the snowbanks, the white landscape began to glow. Not just reflect light, but glow, a shimmering blanket that made the city look reborn. People paused often to admire it, even in the middle of the hard work of clearing and rebuilding. The beauty was undeniable, a frozen world shining like crystal beneath the winter sky. In the early mornings, the snowlight was at its most magical. Pink and gold hues painted the tops of the drifts, while blue shadows pooled softly at their bases. Rooftops gleamed like polished marble. Icicles sparkled clear and flawless, dripping only occasionally as temperatures softened. Entire streets seemed carved from glass, catching the sunrise in gentle waves of color. It was in this soft illumination that Buffalo felt alive again. Families walked together along the newly cleared paths, children dragging sleds behind them, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhoods. Couples ventured out hand in hand, marveling at how the world looked both familiar and transformed. Elderly residents stepped slowly but confidently, taking in the beauty as though grateful simply to witness another morning. Small shops reopened with signs of welcome. Hot cocoa inside. We're back. Storm specials. Everyone needs comfort today. Inside cafes, warm conversations rose like steam. People sat close to windows, watching the sunlight dance across the snow, exchanging stories of the storm while holding warm mugs between their palms. There was a palpable closeness, an unspoken understanding that they had lived through something extraordinary together. Volunteers continued to help clear out side streets and alleyways, their laughter ringing through the crisp air as they worked. Even the sound of shovels scraping across the ground felt lighter now, less burdened, more purposeful, as though each scrape was a step toward reclaiming the city completely. Community centers opened their doors as warming shelters, offering blankets, soup, and companionship. In one such center, families gathered around a long table to share meals provided by neighbors. The room glowed with golden light, the warmth from the heaters swirling softly as people talked, smiled, and recovered together. Buffalo, once frozen silent, now felt vibrant again, reborn in the soft glow of snowlight. And though the blizzard had tested every corner of the city, it had also revealed something just as powerful: the strength of its people, the warmth of their kindness, and the beauty of resilience. As the days continued, the winter sun worked patiently on the massive drifts that lined every street, rooftop, and sidewalk. The melt was unhurried, almost meditative. The snow didn't vanish, it softened. Edges rounded, icicles thinned. The sound of water dripping became a gentle, repeating music that echoed through quiet neighborhoods. Buffalo was still blanketed in white, but the world now held a sense of movement. Meltwater trickled in narrow streams along the sides of roads newly carved open. It pooled at the bases of driveways before freezing again at night, forming small patches of crystalline ice that glimmered like glass. Snowbanks that had loomed like giants began to slump, settling lower with each passing day. People noticed footprints staying visible longer before filling back in. The air, though cold, carried a faint hint of something new, something fresh. In this slow thaw, the city reflected. On porches and in living rooms, at kitchen tables, and inside warm cafes, conversations shifted from survival to meaning. The blizzard had left behind more than snow. It had left a quiet kind of wisdom. One man, sipping coffee with a friend, spoke softly. "We thought we were alone in our houses. Turns out we never were." A woman who had relied on neighbors she barely knew before the storm reflected that the blizzard had drawn invisible lines of connection between people who had lived only steps apart for years. Now those lines glowed warmly, unmistakably present. Parents taught their children something deeper than weather safety. They taught them gratitude for warmth, for shelter, for the neighbor who shared a generator, for the stranger who dug out their doorstep. Teenagers who had helped shovel out entire blocks found themselves treated as quiet heroes. They accepted the praise with shy smiles, not for recognition, but because helping felt like the most natural thing in the world. City workers, exhausted but proud, shared stories of their longest shifts, digging through frozen hills taller than trucks, rescuing families buried behind snow-sealed doors, guiding emergency vehicles through makeshift paths. Their efforts had been relentless, and Buffalo thanked them with signs taped to windows, small gifts left on porch steps, and warm meals delivered with grateful hands. And everywhere, people noticed a change within themselves. The storm had taught patience in its long hours of waiting, gratitude in its moments of danger, courage in its relentless challenge, community in its deep stillness. Buffalo would melt back into the world it had been before, but those lessons, planted deep in the snow, would remain long after the drifts were gone. The city had been brought to its knees by the blizzard, but it had risen again, stronger and kinder. As the last of the towering drifts eased into gentle mounds and the roads finally stretched clear from end to end, Buffalo returned to its familiar rhythm. Schools reopened, buses rumbled along their routes again, and shop windows once more glowed with evening light. Yet beneath this return to normalcy, something quieter, deeper, lingered in the hearts of those who had weathered the storm. The blizzard of '77 became more than an event. It became a memory, a shared chapter stitched into the very fabric of the city. People found themselves pausing when they passed certain corners, recalling the drifts that had once risen higher than the stop signs. They looked at rooftops and remembered how the snow had piled in shapes both beautiful and terrifying. They glanced at neighbors with whom they'd shared stories, food, or silent moments of fear, and felt a connection that would never fully fade. In one home, a mother tucked her children into bed and whispered about the night the wind roared like a living creature and how they had all huddled together, fighting fear with warmth and closeness. The children listened with wide eyes, seeing the blizzard through the lens of safety and love, not danger. An elderly man placed a lantern on his windowsill, no longer because it was needed to guide anyone through the storm, but because it reminded him of the hope he had kept burning throughout those frozen nights. Its glow had comforted him then, and it comforted him still. Friends who had dug tunnels between houses continued to meet for coffee, their laughter echoing the shared triumph of their efforts. Neighbors who had barely known each other before the blizzard now waved every morning. Some even exchanged recipes for the soups and stews that had warmed them during the storm. And though the city thawed completely in time, the blizzard carved something lasting into Buffalo's identity. It taught the community about resilience, the unshakable, enduring strength that rises in people when the world turns cold and uncertain. It taught about compassion, the instinct to check on one another, to share what little you have, to offer warmth where it's most needed. It taught about wonder, how even in hardship beauty remains, the shimmering snowlight, the crystalline trees, the quiet peace after the storm's roar. Most of all, it taught Buffalo something profound and unforgettable, that even when nature reveals its fiercest side, human kindness can outshine it. The memory of the blizzard of '77 would be passed on, not with fear, but with reverence, a story of snowy hardship woven with threads of warmth, courage, and unity. A story the city would carry proudly, quietly, and gratefully through the winters to come. Thank you for journeying through this frozen chapter of history with me, through the roar of the storm, the quiet of snow-lit mornings, and the warmth of a community rising together. As you close your eyes tonight, let the calm of the snow-covered streets and the slow thaw of hope linger softly in your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you gently to like, subscribe, and share your reflections in the comments, whether you're watching from the U.S., Europe, Canada, or somewhere else in the world, and whatever time of night or day you're listening. Your presence adds warmth to this space. Now rest deeply, knowing that even in the coldest storms, light, connection, and resilience always find their way through. Good night.